Once again, a great. All right. Once again, great morning to everyone. We're still on the day two of our Cluster 6 Training of Trainers.
For the information of everybody, what we are viewing right now is a breakout session of the junior high school level. Particularly this time, we will walk through on the most essential learning competencies of school year 2020 to 2021.
Truly, you heard it right. This is the breakout session for the junior high school level on the walkthrough on the most essential learning competencies. A reminder for our participants, please do accomplish your morning attendance for it is about to close.
Furthermore, this morning session is anchored to the Department of Education's commitment to sustaining the delivery of quality, accessible, relevant, and liberating Philippine-based education services anchored on the Sulong o the Kalidad framework. It will continue to strive to produce holistic Filipino learners with 21st century skills.
True enough, Mom Lucille. We will review more about the most essential learning competencies today, which will serve as one of the guides of our teachers as they address the instructional needs of our learners and ensuring that the curriculum standards are maintained and achieved.
That's right, Kim. So this will be the order of presentation for today. For the morning session, first, we will have the English subject presented to us by Ma'am Maria Duresi O. Franca, which will be followed by Filipino, presented to us by Ma'am Arlene E. Bacal, after which will be mathematics to be presented by Sir Alfredo N. Tuon. For the afternoon session, we will begin with science by Ma'am Rowena P. Espera, which will be followed by math subject to be presented by Ma'am Edna M. Rivera. Then, TLE subject to be presented by Dr. Christina A. Bugno. Following will be Aralin Pangkunan to be presented by Ma'am Maria Alma L. Adriana. And finally, will be PSP to be presented to us by Ma'am Lorna A. Day.
For every four sets of presenters, we will be having an open forum to address the questions of our training participants. So there will be an open forum in the morning and another one in the afternoon.
So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them on our comment section so they may be entertained later on.
Okay, now without further ado, let us begin with the English subject. So to our director, please roll the video.
To our Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Janito O. Galan, our beloved principal, Ma'am Leia M. Camilotes, to all school principals, school heads, cluster consultants, cluster coordinators, teachers of Cluster 6, a pleasant day to all. I am Maria Juresi Simafranca, the Cluster 6 English Coordinator, and I will be discussing the most essential competencies for English. Today, as we face the new normal, the Department of Education continues to adapt and keep up with the changes. From our original curriculum guide, we now have our most essential competencies, or the MELCs, to ensure that all grade level standards are still achieved despite the shortened academic year. However, the MELCs is not a direct response to the current pandemic. In fact, MELCS has been identified by the Bureau of Curriculum Development for the past 18 months. Experts and specialists have worked hand in hand to come up with essential learning competencies. The ELC are carefully chosen and has undergone validation taking into account that it is contextualized. As we discuss the MELCs, let us also clarify some terms and concepts which are essential in understanding the totality of the most essential competencies. Here are some of the characteristics of an essential learning competency. First one, it is aligned with the national state and or local standards or frameworks. It connects the content to higher concepts across content areas. It is applicable to real-life situations. It is more important than other LCs. Lastly, it is not expected to be learned from parents or communities. Therefore, it would not be expected for most students to learn this other than a formal education. The question now is, how did they choose the essential learning competencies? What criteria did they consider? To answer that, experts in the field use the endurance criterion. A learning competency is considered enduring if it remains with learners long after tests or unit of study is completed. In English, examples of such learning competencies include research skills, reading comprehension, writing, map reading, and hypothesis testing. These are essential in many professions and in everyday life. Now, which LCs were considered enduring? It is considered enduring if LCs work in close association with other competencies in other subjects, maintaining the curricular quality of integration. Example, grade 4, quarter 1, identify different meanings of content-specific words, denotation, and connotation. In teaching literature, the word blue may refer to a certain emotion or it may mean sadness. However, in science, color blue is simply a color. Next, another thing, an LC that does not recur or recurrence is limited per key stage while observing spiral progression. Example, Key Stage 2, Grade 6, Quarter 2, detect biases and propaganda devices used by speakers. Key Stage 3, Grade 8, Quarter 3, examine biases for or against made by the author. This is not enduring since the LC recurred in Key Stage 2 and 3. Let us also bear in mind that our LCs can be taught more than once, depending on the needs of our learners, and as long as all competencies are achieved in a specific grade level. Now, which LCs again were considered enduring? Those LCs of the same nature that can be clustered together. So we have here an example, English grade 4, quarter 1. These are the competencies from our curriculum guide. Note details in literary text, listen to. Note details in selection, listen to. Note details in asking, answering, poem, listen to. So these three competencies are clustered into one. So we now have note significant details of various text types. Since the competencies are clustered, meaning to say, unpacking and subtasking should be used so that bigger and broader LCs can be broken down into manageable sub-competencies. Example, Use a variety of informative, persuasive, and argumentative writing techniques. This would entail a number of other competencies in order for it to be achieved. First one, making a stand for persuasive. Second, gathering information for various sources and citing sources of information. So this is an example of subtasking or unpacking of this competency. I hope that is clear. Now, our competencies can be suggestive in nature. The duration of an LC is relative. What is required is that the list of competencies be achieved in the specific grade level. Later on, I will show you an example of how our MELCs are arranged in such a way that the duration of an LC becomes relative. So this is now a comparison of our most essential learning competencies and our current curriculum guide. So this is how our curriculum guide looks like. Now take note, in our curriculum guide, we consider the program standard, the grade level standard, the content standard, and the performance standard. It also follows a horizontal alignment. So we have here the time, week 1, and then all domains should be met by week 1. Now let us take a look at the number of competencies in our curriculum guide compared to our most essential learning competencies. So we have here grade 1. From 56, we now have 12. Grade 2, 234 to 34. Grade 3, 275 to 46. Grade 4, 307 to 28. Grade 5, 432 to 15. Grade 6, 388. We are now down to 10. Grade 7, 356 to 29. Grade 8, 389 to 22. Grade 9, 370 to only 10. And grade 10, 313 to 23. In total, our current CG has 3,120. And our most essential competencies is now down to 229. How were the MELCs organized? It should be noted that domains were no longer retained as they may cause confusion among end users. The original curriculum guide was designed in such a way that domains work together through horizontal alignment, since one lesson does not tackle only one macro skill, but multiple skills. However, during the examination of LCs using endurance criterion, some skills under a particular domain can no longer be retained. Organizing the MELCs by domain through columns, as in the original curriculum guide, would render the document seemingly incomplete and harder to follow due to the absence of horizontal alignment. So just like our arrangement of our MELCs here, we no longer have the domains. So the MELCs were organized or arranged in a list based on cognitive demand, which makes way for better curriculum flexibility as teachers are able to freely integrate LCs without the restrictions of horizontal alignment. So we now have the grading period and then the learning competencies. No domains, no week number. How were MELCs organized? Because the content and performance standards in the English curriculum are described in such detail, the process of determining the MELCs required that some of these standards be forgone. So we no longer use the content standard and the performance standard. For the MELCs, we only have the grade level standard. So as you can see, this is our original curriculum guide. We do away with the horizontal alignment, and we only have the arrangement of melts that I've shown you a while ago. Now let us have a walkthrough of the melts. So key stage 1, grades 1 to 3. Here are the grade level standards. These are taken from the curriculum guide. Grade 1, the learner listens for comprehension, speaks clearly and uses appropriate expressions in talking about oneself, family, and other social context interactions. Grade 2, the learner listens critically to 1 to 2 paragraphs, use appropriate expressions in varied situations, read texts for pleasure and information critically in meaningful thought units, responds properly to environmental prints like signs, posters, commands, and requests, and writes legibly simple sentences and messages in cursive form. Grade 3, the learner listens critically to get information from texts heard, demonstrates independence in using the basic language structure in oral and written communication, and reads in with comprehension. So as you can see, some competencies were merged, retained, or dropped. So the process of deciding whether a learning competency is to be retained, merged, dropped, or rephrased, as a general rule, a learning competency was retained if it satisfies the endurance criterion, which greatly contributes to lifelong learning and is prerequisite skill to the next grade level. 2 or more learning competencies are merged or clustered into one comprehensive learning competency if they have the same objective or learning intention. A significant number of learning competencies were removed, dropped due to the following reasons. They are too specific and the articulation is similar to that of a learning objective. They are deemed appropriate to be introduced in an earlier quarter or grade level or moved to a latter quarter or grade level. They are recurring. They are subsumed in another learning competency. So those are the things that were considered why some melts are retained, rephrased, or dropped. So we have here an example of the melts. English 2, third quarter. So we have here, these are similar, therefore it is retained or rephrased as melts. Read phrases, short sentences, and short stories consisting of words in short E-A-I-O-U, and then answer the who, what, and where questions about them. Next one, this is an example of LC, which is dropped from our MELCs. Use common expressions and polite greetings. Justification. During the curriculum review in 2019, this is one of the LCs tagged as desirable and was therefore no longer returned as a MELC. Another one, review reading and writing, short A-E-I-O-U words in CBC pattern. This is an example of an LC from the CG that is retained to ensure a smooth flow of transition from reading to writing. Thus, a review of the short sounds is necessary. This will also be helpful in case all the short sounds were covered in previous levels. So it's like a prerequisite skill. Now, next stage, or the key stage 2 for grades 4 to 6. So we have here the grade level standards. Grade 4, the learner listens critically to various text types and express ideas accurately in both oral, written forms, demonstrates confidence in the use of the language to meet everyday needs, and reads independently and gets relevant information from various texts. Grade 5, the learner listens critically to different text types, including news reports and other radio broadcasts, reads independently and gets relevant information from various text types, expresses ideas accurately and logically, in oral and written forms, demonstrates interest in reading, and confidence in the use of the language to meet various everyday needs. Grade 6, the learner listens critically, communicates feelings and ideas orally and in writing with a high level of proficiency, and reads various text types, materials to serve learning needs in meeting a wide range of life's purposes. So we have here English grade 4, quarter 1, an example of competencies which were clustered into one. So for vocabulary, use context clues to find meaning of unfamiliar words. Use context clues, synonyms to find meaning of unfamiliar words. Use context clues, synonyms to find meaning of unfamiliar words. Use context clues, this time antonym, to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. Lastly, use context clues for definition to determine the meaning of unfamiliar words. Now, these are all similar, therefore it can be clustered into one, and we now have our new essential learning competency, use context clues to find meanings of unfamiliar words. Take note, if a competency is clustered, you have to unpack or subtask. Now let's have another example for English 4, quarter 1. Show willingness and enthusiasm in reading or listening to a literary text. All LCs under the attitude domain were deleted, as this may be subsumed in another learning area, example ESP, that focuses on attitude formation. This one is learning competency which was retained. Write or compose an editorial. The identified LC was considered a MILK and therefore retained because it satisfied the endurance criterion, which states that the learning competency should play a role in lifelong learning. In particular, given the cognitive demand of the LC, unpacking it would necessitate a number of other essential learning competencies. We have here making a stand, developing arguments, supporting claims with evidence, and etc., because it is an editorial. Next, key stage 3 for grades 7 to 10. We have here the grade level standards. Grade 7. The learner demonstrates communicative competence through his or her understanding of Philippine literature and other text types for a deeper appreciation of Philippine culture. Grade 8. The learner demonstrates communicative competence through his or her understanding of Afro-Asian literature and other text types for a deeper appreciation of Philippine culture and those of other countries. Grade 9. The learner demonstrates communicative competence through his or her understanding of British American literature, including Philippine literature and other text types for a deeper appreciation of Philippine culture and those of other countries. Grade 10. The learner demonstrates communicative competence through his or her understanding of literature and other text types for a deeper appreciation of world literature, including Philippine literature. Now take a look at from our CG. Since these LCs develop skills on employing a variety of interpersonal communication strategies, they were merged into a MELC. So we now have employ a variety of strategies for effective interpersonal communication. Interview, dialogue, conversation, and etc. Another example, this LC was retained, express one's beliefs, convictions based on a material viewed. Expressing one's belief or conviction on material viewed is an indication that a learner has already established skills on making a stand taught in earlier grade level. Now, this is an example of LCs which were dropped. So here are the LCs from our curriculum guide. These learning competencies were dropped due to recurrence because it is on the same key stage. Now, it can be subsumed in employ a variety of strategies for effective interpersonal communication, interview, dialogue, and conversation. Lastly, we have the last key stage, senior high school, grades 11 to 12. So they used course description, core subject reading and writing, grade 11 or 12. The development of reading and writing skills as applied to a wide range of materials other than poetry, fiction, and drama. So we have it here. These LCs were merged into a modified LC since both develop skills on written text. Evaluate a written text based on its properties, organization, coherence and cohesion, language use, and mechanics. Explains how one's purpose is a crucial consideration in academic and professional writing. This LC was dropped since it is already subsumed in the competency below. So this is under identifies the unique features of and requirements in composing texts that are useful across disciplines. We have here book review or article critique, literature review, research report, project proposal, and position paper. So that would be all for the most essential learning competencies in English. I hope I gave you a comprehensive discussion about it. Thank you so much for listening.
Isang kasiyahan po na makasama kayo sa araw na ito para ibahagi sa inyo ang pinakamahalagang kasanayang Filipino. Sa tulong ng bidyong ipapakita ko, naway makatulong ito sa mga guro sa kanilang pagtuturo, lalong-lalo na sa panahon na nasa kalagitnaan tayo ng pandemya. Alam ko pong siksik na siksik at nag-uumapaw na ang inyong kaalaman sa pagtuturo. Dama ko rin ang inyong nararamdaman. Ang tagapamahala sa Cluster 6 na pinangungunahan ni Dr. Junito Ogalan ay naglalayon na mas lalong mapatatas ang mga guro sa kanilang pagtuturo sa larang Filipino. Nais ko pong tunghayan ninyo ang bidyong ito ng MELCS na ibabahagi sa atin ng ating tagamasid pansangay ng Dibisyon Lungsod ng Davao na walang iba kundi si Dr. Rene Pontilla Sultan.
Narito tayo ngayon sa orientasyon sa paggamit ng pinakamahalagang kagamitang kasanayang pampagkatuto sa Pilipino from grade 1 to grade 12. Unang-una, balikan natin ang conceptual na balangkas sa Pilipino. Ibig sabihin, nasa mga teorya ng pagkatuto ng wika, nakaangkla ang pag-aaral at pagtuturo ng Pilipino. Nasa sentro ng programa ang mga mag-aaral bilang pangunahing beneficiary ng ating pagtuturo. At inaasahan natin na sila ay magiging buo at ganap na Pilipino na may kapakipakinabang na literacy. Sa ating mga mag-aaral, dapat malinang sa kanila ang tatlong bagay na ito. Una, kakayahang komunikatibo. Pangalawa, reflektibo, mapanuring pag-iisip. At ang pangatlo, pagpapahalagang pampanitikan. Paano natin malilinang ang mga ito? Ito ay malilinang sa pamamagitan ng mga babasahin at teknolohiya. At ang pangunahing kalalabasan nito ay malinang sa kanila ang pambansang pagkakakilanlan, kultural na literacy at patuloy na pagkatuto. Ganon din, makaagapay sila sa mabilis na pagbabagong nagaganap sa daigdig. Ang Pilipino, dati-rati na may kasanayan na umabot higit 2,000, ngayon ay pinaikli natin. At lumabas nga ang mga lalong kapaki-pakinabang na mga kasanayang pampagkatuto sa Pilipino. Meron tayong 2,378 o 2,378 mga kasanayan. Ngayon ay naging 708 na lang na mga kasanayan sa Pilipino mula unang baitang hanggang baitang 12. Paano natin pinili ang mga makabuluhan o kapaki-pakinabang na competency sa Pilipino? Ang unang pamantayan o natatanging pamantayan na ating ginawa ay ang endurance o pagiging pangmatagalan ng mga kasanayan. Pangmatagalan sapagkat kapaki-pakinabang ito sa pag-aaral ng iba't ibang kasanayan, maaaring sa ibang asignatura o sa iba pang mga subkasanayan sa Pilipino. Makikita natin ito sa mga kasanayan sa pananaliksik, pagbasa, pagsulat, pagbasa ng mga mapa, hypothesis testing o pagsubok ng mga palagay. Endurance, ibig sabihin, nagagamit sa totoong buhay. Halimbawa nito ay makikita natin sa Pilipino sa ikalimang baitang na ibabahagi ang pangyayaring nasaksihan o naobserbahan. Ang kasanayang ito ay makikita din natin sa iba pang baitang o maging sa iba pang mga asignatura na mga wikang pangturo ay Filipino, katulad ng Araling Panlipunan, Edukasyon sa Pagkakatao at EPP. Pangalawa, pangmatagalan din kung ito ay lubhang kailangan upang matutuhan pa ang mga kasanayan sa ibang asignatura gaya ng nabanggit ko kanina. Isinaalang-alang din ang pagsasakatuparan ng mga pamantayan sa bawat baitang, sa mga key stages natin. Anong nangyari sa mga kasanayan na nasa curriculum natin dati? May mga competencies or mga kasanayan na pinanatili, may mga pinagsama, may mga tinanggal, at may inayos. Ngayon, tingnan natin anong nangyari sa baitang 7 hanggang 10. Nasa high school tayo, sa mataas na paaralan. Sa ikapitong baitang, may mga kasanayan tayong inayos, ni-rephrase natin, may mga kasanayang pinagsama or merge natin at na-cluster. Halimbawa, tingnan natin ito sa Filipino 7, PT. Naipaliliwanag ang kahulugan, talasalitaan ito, naipaliliwanag ang kahulugan ng salita sa pamamagitan ng pagpapangkat-pangkat. Pangalawa, nabibigyan kahulugan ng mga salita batay sa konteksto ng pangungusap. Nabibigyan kahulugan ang mga salitang ginamit sa kwento batay sa kontekstual na pahiwatig, denotasyon at konotasyon. Naibibigay ang kasing kahulugan at kasalungat ng kahulugan ng salita ayon sa gamit sa pangungusap. Kung napapansin natin, ito ay nauukol sa paglinang ng talasalitaan, pagpapayaman ng talasalitaan, pagpapayabong ng bokabularyo, pagpapayaman ng ating mga salita. So ang ginawa natin ito dahil nga paulit-ulit na nakikita sa kasanayang pampagkatuto sa ikapitong baitang, inayos natin. Ano ang dahilan? Pahalaga ang kasanayang ito sa pag-unawa sa binasa. Yun nga, dahil nga ang Pilipino, balikan natin ang ating tinalakay na dapat malinang sa kanila ang kakayahang komunikatibo, kritikal na pag-unawa. Kaya't napakahalaga ang paglinang ng mga talasalitaan. Ginawa natin ito na ipaliliwanag ang mga kahulugan ng salita sa pamamagitan ng pagpapangkat-pangkat batay sa konteksto, pangungusap, denotasyon at konotasyon batay sa kasing kahulugan at kasalungat na ito. Tingnan natin, ang 5 o ang 5 mga kasanayang pampagkatuto ay naging isa na lang. At nakita natin ang pagiging holistiko ng mga kasanayan na higit na nauunawaan ng mga teacher na nagagamit nito sa kanilang mga klase sa Pilipino. Tingnan natin halimbawa ang baitang 8, baitang 8. Inayos natin. Isa sa mga halimbawa ay ang pag-aayos ng mga kasanayang pampagkatutok gaya ng nasusuri ang isang programang napanood sa telebisyon ayon sa itinakdang mga pamantayan. Ano ang dahilan? Isinama ang kasanayang pampagkatuto na ito dahil kailangan sa ating mga mag-aaral na maging mapanuri sa mga pinanunood sa telebisyon para maging tiyak sa ipinagagawa isinaayos ang kasanayang ito para maging most essential learning competency. Nang binago, ito ay naging nasusuri ang napanood na pelikula batay sa paksa or tema or batay sa layon, batay sa gamit ng mga salita at mga tauhan. Napapansin natin, mas nagiging konkreto kung ano ang ipagagawa natin sa mga mag-aaral kaysa ibigay sa kanila ang mga itinakdang pamantayan. Hindi malinaw sa mga estudyante natin ano-ano ang pamantayan iyon. Ngunit dito sa MELC natin ay isa-isang inilatag ang mga pamantayan, paksa or tema, layon, gamit ng mga salita at mga tauhan. Tingnan natin halimbawa sa Baitang 9. Ang Baitang 9 na tumatalakay sa mga akdang pampanitikan mula sa mga bansang Asyano. Tinanggal natin ang isa sa mga competency na itatanghal ang dulang panteatro na pumapaksa sa mga napapanahong isyang panlipunan sa kasalukuyan. Tinanggal ang competency ito dahil hindi magagawa ng mag-aaral mag-isa na nangangailangan ng face-to-face na ugnayan. So isa ito sa halimbawa ng competency na hindi natin pwedeng gawin sa ganitong kalagayan, nasa pandemya tayo, sapagkat kailangan ito ng face-to-face, harapang pagtuturo ng guro. Kaya ipagpaliban muna natin ang paglinang ng competency ito. Tingnan natin sa ika-10 baitang, ang huling taon sa junior high school. Pinanatili natin ang kasanayang nagagamit ang angkop at masining na paglalarawan ng tao, pangyayari at damdamin. Pinatili natin ang kasanayang ito dahil tumutugon ito sa kahingian ng endurance o pangmatagalan na nagagamit sa pakikipag-ugnayan sa ibang tao. Ang paglalarawan ay isa sa component ng kakayahang komunikatibo na nagagamit natin hindi lang sa karaniwang pag-uusap, kundi maging sa kanilang pag-aaral sa iba pang asignatura, sa iba pang mga proseso ng komunikasyon. Napakahalaga pa rin sa Pilipino o sa alinmang asignatura na himayin natin ang ating most essential learning competencies para sa mga tiyak na kasanayang pampagkatuto. Ibig sabihin ng himayin, isa-isahin natin ano ba ang mga kaakibat na mga sub-competencies para sa bawat isang MELC. Tingnan natin. Ito halimbawa, nagagamit ng wasto ang mga pangalan at panghalip sa pagtalakay tungkol sa sarili, tao, hayop, lugar, bagay at pangyayari sa paligid, sa usapan at paglalahad ng tungkol sa karanasan. So maari natin itong himayin, katulad ng tukuyin muna natin ang kahulugan ng pangalan at panghalip. Maaring magbibigay tayo ng halimbawa sa dalawang bahagi ng pananalitang ito. Maaring magbibigay tayo ng reaksyon sa isang usapin at maaring magsasalaysay tayo ng isang karanasan. Nakita natin ang isang competency ay hinimay natin. Nagkaroon tayo ng mga sub-competency ukol sa pangalawa, pagbibigay kahulugan, halimbawa, at pagbibigay ng reaksyon o pagsasalaysay ng karanasan. Yan. Ulitin ang ilang MELC sa iba pang markahan sa bawat baitang kung kinakailangan o lalong paglinang nito. Ang tawag natin mga essential, enabling competencies. Diba? O kung nagkakaroon na sila ng talakayan tungkol sa mga pang-abay, maaring balikan muna ang mga salitang naglalarawan. Maaring pag-aralan muna ang makasanayan ukol sa mga salitang kilos. Okay. Pumili ng mga magkasamang MELC na sasakto sa 8 linggo. Kasi nga yun ang ating takdang panahon. We are given 8 weeks bawat markahan. Titingnan natin ano ang mga kasanayang pampagkatuto, mga lalong mahalagang kasanayang pampagkatuto na dapat nating malinang sa loob ng isang markahan. Maaring sumangguni pa rin tayo sa ating gabay pang kurikulum para sa pagpapasya. At mahalaga, matarget natin ang mga kasanayang pampagkatuto sa bawat baitang. Yun ang pinakatunguhin natin. Matarget natin or malinang natin sa ating mga mag-aaral ang mga kasanayang pampagkatuto na dapat matutuhan nila sa loob ng isang markahan o sa loob ng isang baitang. Bukod sa pagsangguni sa gabay pang kurikulum, Mahalaga rin ang natitingnan natin ang pagpapasyang pagsama-sama ng milk na sumangguni tayo sa final na version ng ating most essential learning competencies kung saan makikita natin ang mga code nito. Ang mga code ay nagsasabi kung ano-anong learning competencies ang pinagsama-sama sa isang milk. Paalala, bibigyang halaga pa rin natin ang mga guro na makapili ng magkakasamang learning competency sa bawat linggo. Alam natin ang uri ng mga mag-aaral meron tayo at alam natin ang takbo ng kanilang pagkakatuto. So, ang teacher, ang guro mismo ang may kakayahang magpasya. Aling mga kasanaya ang dapat malinang ko sa bawat linggo at gaano o ilang araw ang iuukol ko sa pagtuturo ng nasabing kasanayan. Ang layunin ng pagpili ng MELC ay hindi upang palitan ang kasalukuyang curriculum guide, kundi magabayan ang mga guro sa pagtukoy ng mga competencing mas kinakailangan ng mga mag-aaral para sa taong panuruan 2020 hanggang 2021. Hinihikayat pa rin ang mga guro na sumangguni sa ating curriculum guide sa Pilipino, yung ating gabay pang curriculum sa Pilipino. So, sa Pilipino, aasahan pa rin natin na matatapos yung ating tunguhin na makapagbibigay tayo ng mga mag-aaral na buo, ganap, na may kapakipakinabang na literacy.
Nais ko pong ipaabot ang aking taus-pusong pasasalamat sa mga bumubuo
So that's the next presentation, the English and Filipino subject. Thank you so much, Ma'am Maria Duresi Osimafranca and Ma'am Arlene E. Bacalso.
All right. So at this point, I suppose it is timely to invite on screen our first two presenters. So let us welcome Mom Arlene and Mom Jorsey. Hello, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ma'am Maria Duresi and Ma'am Arlene Bacalso.
Magandang umaga.
So how was it, ma'am? How was your presentation? How are you feeling during the presentation, ma'am? Anyone? Ma'am Maria Duresi?
Well, during the presentation, it is really timely indeed, and I think everybody, all teachers can learn from it, especially now that we are using the most essential competencies. Although I would also like to add that we cannot do away with our original curriculum guide, okay? It will always still be our guide. In maybe in unpacking the competencies, we can always refer back to the curriculum guide as to what are the prerequisite skills that can be used in unpacking the competencies.
All right. Thank you, Ma'am Jorsey. So itong tanong na ito is para naman kay Ma'am Arlene. So Ma'am Arlene, for the sake of those na nakatune in lamang sa ating live broadcast, so I would just like to ask, ano po ba yung pagkakaiba nitong most essential learning competencies dun sa nakasanayan na nating curriculum guide?
Okay. Sa nakasanayan nating curriculum guide, may mga competencies or kasanayan tayo na yung bang pabalik-balik or tinatawag nating pabalik-balik na kasanayan lamang. Pero pagdating sa MELCS, sinubukan ng ating tagapagmasid, pangdibisyon, na mapag-isa ito para mas lalong maunawaan ng mga guro, lalong-lalo na ngayon na nasa kalagitnaan tayo ng pandemya.
Alright, maraming salamat po,
Thank you
Ma'am
so much,
Arlene.
Ma'am Arlene.
So I hope klaro yun para sa ating mga participants. So at this point, ma'am, let us read some of the shout-outs para sa ating mga speakers. Alright. So first shout-out.
Okay, so let me read the shout out from Ma'am Anna Joy Kenatoy. So congratulations, Ma'am Resi.
Yes,
So
go.
coming from Ma'am Anna Joy.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Joy.
All right, here's another one from Ma'am Leia Suarez. Congrats, Ma'am Arlene. Mabuhay.
Maraming salamat, Ma'am Leia.
Also, we have on screen Ma'am Diana Rose de Hongoy. So she said, "Good morning, everyone, watching from Matina Biao National High School." Thank you so much, ma'am, for the greetings for today.
Okay, so let us read another shout out. Okay, this is from Hope Locks. So, good morning from Tacunan National High School. This is Oscar F. Guillemit Jr. Okay, so I suppose that's it for our shout outs this morning. And we will proceed to our next most essential learning competencies presentation. So, next on the list will be mathematics to be presented by none other than Sir Alfredo Duan. Let us roll the video. All right. So as of this moment, I suppose we should be hearing more of the shout outs from our participants. All right. So please post some of the shout outs. We have from Sir Arnold Oppen. Good morning from Carmen Integrated School. So very participative talaga tong mga teachers from Carmen Integrated School. So happy viewing, everyone. Next, we have from Ma'am Diana Rose de John Goy. Good morning, everyone, watching from Matina Biao National High School. Hello, ma'am. All right, we have from Ma'am Margie Villaferte. Congratulations, Ma'am Arlene. Congratulations, our presenters. All right. So another shout out. By the way, I would like to greet all our teachers, of course, from my school, Tugbok National High School, who is viewing right now. So, hello po sa inyong lahat. Now, we also have here from Ma'am Eileen Suter Orion. Hooray! Talandang Teaching Force. Laban ta! Laban talandang.
A pleasant day to everyone. My greetings of peace and prosperity to all. First and foremost, my courtesy to our Schools Division Superintendent Dr. Reynaldo M. Galeana, SESO 5, our Cluster 6 Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Janito O. Galan, the consultant in Cluster 6 Mathematics Department, Mr. Jason Jasmine Reyes of Ula National High School, to all the school heads of Cluster 6, and of course, the teaching force of Cluster 6 in the division of Davao City. A pleasant day to all of us. My name is Hazel Joy A. Amnasa from Santo Niño National High School, and today I will be presenting to you the most essential learning competencies, or known as MELCs, in mathematics for the junior high school department. So to begin, let us have first the most essential learning competencies for the grade 7 level. So let us have the first quarter, which is composed of 15 learning competencies and which will last for 9 weeks duration. The first quarter has a content standards which state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of sets and the real number system. And the performance standards state that the learner is able to formulate challenging situations involving sets and real numbers and solve this in a variety of strategies. I've said a while ago that there are 15 learning competencies for the first quarter, of which the week 1 has a competency which states that the learner will illustrate well-defined sets, subsets, universal sets, null set, cardinality of sets, union and intersection of sets, and the difference of two sets. And on the 9th week, the learner is expected to write numbers in scientific notation and vice versa. And also, the learner will represent real-life situations and solve problems involving real numbers. So those are some of the learning competencies under the first quarter in the grade 7 level. Now, let us proceed to the second quarter of the same level. The second quarter has 2 content standards which state that the learner demonstrates understanding of the key concepts of measurement, and also the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of algebraic expressions, the properties of real numbers as applied in linear equations, and inequalities in one variable, while the performance standards state that the learner is able to formulate real-life problems involving measurements and solve this using a variety of strategies, while the other performance standards state that the learner is able to model situations using oral, written, graphical, and algebraic methods in solving problems involving algebraic expressions, linear equations, and inequalities in one variable. Still, the duration will last for 9 weeks, and for the second quarter, there are 16 most essential learning competencies. Let me present to you the first learning competency for the second quarter, which state that the learner approximates the measures of quantities, particularly length, weight or mass, volume, time, angle, and temperature and rate. And at the end of the quarter, the learner is expected to find the solution of linear equation or inequality in one variable, and also the learner solves linear equation or inequality in one variable involving absolute value by graphing and by algebraic methods. So those are 2 of the learning competencies, most essential learning competencies for quarter 2 in grade 7 level. Now let us proceed to the third quarter learning competencies, having 1 content standard and 1 performance standard, of course. The content standard state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of geometry of shapes and sizes and geometric relationships, of which the performance standards state that the learner is able to create models of plane figures and formulate and solve accurately authentic problems involving sides and angles of a polygon. Now, for quarter 3 in grade 7 level, the most essential learning competencies are 11 learning competencies, of which the first learning competency state that the learner is expected to represent point, line, and plane using concrete and pictorial models. And at the end of the quarter, the learner is expected to solve problem involving sides and angles of a polygon as stated in the content and performance standard. So again, there are 11 most essential learning competencies for quarter 3 in grade 7 level. Now let us have the last quarter for grade 7. So the last quarter rather has a content standard which states that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts, uses and importance of statistics, data collection or gathering, and the different forms of data representation, measures of central tendency, measures of variability, and probability. And the performance standards state that the learner is able to collect and organize data systematically and compute accurately measures of central tendency and variability and apply this appropriately in data analysis and interpretation in different fields. For the fourth quarter or the last quarter of grade 7 level, the most essential learning competencies are 11. So having for the week 1, the most essential learning competency states that the learner formulates simple statistical instruments. And in the end, for week 8 to week 9, the learner is expected to use appropriate statistical measures in analyzing and interpreting statistical data, and also the learner draws conclusions from graphic and tabular data and measures of central tendency and variability. So those are the most essential learning competencies in mathematics for grade 7 level. All in all, there are 53 learning competencies that the teacher needs to tackle or discuss or give modules to his or her students. So that would be all for the grade 7 level. Next, let us have the most essential learning competencies for the grade 8 level. Now, let us have first, for the first quarter, the content standards for the first quarter state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of factors of polynomials, rational algebraic expressions, linear equations and inequalities in two variables, systems of linear equations and inequalities in two variables, and linear functions, while the performance standards state that the learner is able to formulate real-life problems involving factors of polynomials, rational algebraic expressions, linear equations, and inequalities in two variables, systems of linear equations and inequalities in two variables, and linear functions, and solve these problems accurately using a variety of strategies. So for the first quarter in grade 8 level, the most essential learning competencies comprise 18 learning competencies, still having a duration of until 9th week or week 9 weeks, of which the first week up to week 2 has a learning competency which states that the learner factors completely different types of polynomials, like the polynomials with common monomial factor, difference of two squares, sum and difference of two cubes, perfect square trinomials, and general trinomials. And up to the last week, the student or the learner is expected to solve problems involving systems of linear equations in two variables by 3 methods: by graphing, substitution, and by elimination. So those are the learning competencies for the first quarter. Now, let us have the most essential learning competencies for the second quarter, of which the content standards, there are two content standards for second quarter. The following are: the learner will demonstrate key concepts of linear inequalities in two variables, systems of linear inequalities in two variables, and linear functions. And also, the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of logic and reasoning. And for the performance standards, the learner is able to formulate and solve accurately real-life problems involving linear inequalities in two variables, system of linear inequalities in two variables, and linear functions. Also, the learner is able to communicate mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity in formulating and analyzing arguments. For the second quarter, the most essential learning competencies comprise 16 learning competencies, of which the first competency for the week 1, there are 3 learning competencies assigned for the first week, which are differentiating linear inequalities in two variables from linear equations in two variables, illustrates and graphs linear inequalities in two variables, and solves problems involving linear inequalities in two variables, of which the student or the learner is expected to achieve in week 9 the two learning competencies, which state that the learner uses inductive or deductive reasoning in an argument and writes a proof, both direct and indirect. Right, so that's the learning competencies for the second quarter in grade 8 level. Now let's proceed to the third quarter. The third quarter has a content standard which states that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of axiomatic structure of geometry and triangle congruence, while the performance standard states that there are two performance standards for the third quarter. First, the learner is able to formulate an organized plan to handle a real-life situation. And second, the learner is able to communicate mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity in formulating, investigating, analyzing, and solving real-life problems involving congruent triangles using appropriate and accurate representations. So let us have now the most essential learning competencies for the third quarter. It is only composed of 8 learning competencies. For week 1 up to week 2, the learning competencies expected for the learners to achieve are: first, describe a mathematical system and illustrate the need for an axiomatic structure of a mathematical system in general and in geometry in particular, like defined terms, undefined terms, postulates, and theorems. And for week 8 to week 9, the learner applies triangle congruence to construct perpendicular lines and angle bisectors. So those are the learning competencies for the third quarter in grade 8 level. And now, up for the fourth quarter level, having 10 learning competencies. There are 2 content standards and definitely 2 performance standards also for fourth quarter. For the content standards, it states that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of inequalities in triangle and parallel and perpendicular lines. Also, the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of probability. And for the performance standards, the learner is able to communicate mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity in formulating, investigating, analyzing, and solving real-life problems involving triangle inequalities and parallelism and perpendicularity of lines using appropriate and accurate representations. And also, the learner is able to formulate and solve practical problems involving probability of simple events. Now, let us proceed to the most essential learning competencies for the fourth quarter, which is composed of 10 learning competencies. The week one, the learner is expected to illustrate theorems on triangle inequalities such as the exterior angle inequality theorem, triangle inequality theorem, and hinge theorem. And for the last week, week 9, the learner will now illustrate an experimental probability and theoretical probability, and also will solve problems involving probabilities of simple events. So those are the most essential learning competencies together with the content and performance standards for grade 8 level in mathematics. In all, there are 52 most essential learning competencies for grade 8 level. And now this time, let us have for the grade 9 level. For the first quarter is composed of 16 most essential learning competencies. The content standards state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of quadratic equations, inequalities and functions, and rational algebraic expressions. On the performance standards, it states that the learner is able to investigate thoroughly mathematical relationships in various situations, formulate real-life problems involving quadratic equations, inequalities and functions, and rational algebraic equations, and solve them using a variety of strategies. Now, for week 1 of the most essential learning competency, it states that the learner is expected to illustrate quadratic equations, while on the week 9, which has 2 learning competencies, the following are: the learner determines the equation of a quadratic function given A, table of values, B, graph, and C, zeros. And also, the learner will solve problems involving quadratic functions. So those are some of the most essential learning competencies for the first quarter. Now let's proceed to the second quarter. For the content standards, the learner will demonstrate understanding of key concepts of variation and radicals, while the performance standards, the learner is able to formulate and solve accurately problems involving radicals. In the second quarter, there are 11 most essential learning competencies or MELCs. Now let me present the learning competencies for week 1 up to week 2. First, the learner illustrates situations that involve the following variations: direct, inverse, joint, and combined. And also, the learner translates into variation statement a relationship between two quantities given by a table of values, a mathematical equation, a graph, and vice versa. And on the last week, the learner will solve problems involving radicals. So those are some of the learning competencies under the second quarter of the grade 9 level. And next, let's have the third quarter. The third quarter content standards state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of parallelograms and triangle similarity, while for the performance standards, the learner is able to investigate, analyze, and solve problems involving parallelograms and triangle similarity through appropriate and accurate representation. And let me give you the first and the second learning competencies for the third quarter. First, the learner determines the conditions that make a quadrilateral a parallelogram. And second, the learner uses properties to find measures of angles, sides, and other quantities involving parallelograms. While on week 9, the last week, For each quarter, the learner will now solve problems that involve triangle similarity and right triangles. There are other learning competencies, but I only presented to you the competencies for the first week and the last week of each quarter. Now let us proceed to the fourth quarter of the grade 9 level. The content standard states that the learner demonstrates understanding of the basic concepts of geometry. And for the performance standards, the learner is able to apply the concepts of trigonometric ratios to formulate and solve real-life problems with precision and accuracy. Same way with the other learning competencies, I will present to you the first competency for the quarter. The learning competency states that the learner illustrates the six trigonometric ratios, the sine, cosine, tangent, secant, cosecant, and cotangent. And finally, on week 6 up to week 9, the learners are expected to first illustrate laws of sines and cosines, and finally solves problems involving oblique triangles. So again, I just presented some of the most essential learning competencies for each quarter. For the fourth quarter for grade 9 level is composed of 6 learning competencies. In totality, there are 46 most essential learning competencies for the grade 9 level. So again, those are the learning competencies for the grade 9 level. And now we're down to the last grade level for the junior high school department, the grade 10 level. Now let us have the first quarter. For the first quarter for grade 10 level in mathematics is composed of 12 most essential learning competencies. Now let me present first the content standards, which state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of sequences, polynomials, and polynomial equations, while the performance standards state that the learner is able to formulate and solve problems involving sequences, polynomials, and polynomial equations in different disciplines through appropriate and accurate representations. Again, there are 12 most essential learning competencies, and I will present to you the first 3 competencies for week 1 up to week 3, which states that the learner generates patterns. Also, the learner is expected to illustrate an arithmetic sequence and determines arithmetic means, nth term of an arithmetic sequence, and sum of the terms of a given arithmetic sequence. And on week 9, the learner will solve problems involving polynomials and polynomial equations. So those are some of the most essential learning competencies for the first quarter. And the same with the first quarter. For the second quarter, it is also composed of 12 learning competencies. There are 2 content standards which state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of polynomial functions and demonstrates understanding of key concepts of circles and coordinate geometry. While for the performance standards, the learner is able to conduct systematically a mathematical investigation involving a polynomial functions in different fields, and also the learner is able to first formulate and find solutions to challenging situations involving circles and other related terms in different disciplines through appropriate and accurate representations, and able to formulate and solve problems involving geometric figures on the rectangular coordinate plane with perseverance and accuracy. Now let me present to you the first 3 learning competencies for the quarter 2. First, the learner illustrates polynomial functions. And second, the learner understand, describe, and interpret the graphs of polynomial functions, solves problems involving polynomial functions. And in week 9, finally, the learner is expected to graph and solve problems involving circles and other geometric figures on the coordinate plane. Alright, now let's proceed to the third quarter of the same level. The content standards state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of combinatorics and probability. And for the performance standards, the learner is able to use precise counting technique and probability in formulating conclusions and making decisions. For the most essential learning competencies, it is comprised of 9 learning competencies for the third quarter, of which the first learning competency states that the learner illustrates the permutation of objects. And on week 9, the learner is expected to illustrate this time mutually exclusive events and solve problems involving probability. And now let's proceed to the last quarter, the fourth quarter of grade 10 level. For the fourth quarter, it is composed of 6 most essential learning competencies, and the content standards state that the learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of measures and position. And for the performance standards, the learner is able to conduct systematically a mini research applying the different statistical methods. Now, for the learning competency, for the first learning competency for week 1, it states that the learner will illustrate the following measures of position, such as quartiles, deciles, and percentiles. While on the last 2 weeks, for week 8 and week 9, the learner is expected to use appropriate measures of position and other statistical methods in analyzing and interpreting research data. So those are the most essential learning competencies for grade 10 level. In totality, there are 13 learning competencies in all. Now, if we are going to add all of the competencies from grade 7 level down to grade 10 level rather, for mathematics, the learning competencies comprise of 190 competencies in all. So that would be all for the most essential learning competencies for mathematics in the junior high school department. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless us all.
My courtesy to our Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Junito Ogalan, to our Education Program Supervisor in Science, Ma'am Genevieve Faye Pasamonte, to our Cluster Science Consultant, Dr. Helen G. Reyno, to all the principals in Cluster 6, and to everyone who's watching us right now, good day. This will be the order of my presentation. First, we will have the presentation of the Science Curriculum Conceptual Framework, followed by the comparison on the number of learning competencies in science curriculum and the most essential learning competencies. Next, we will have a short discussion on how did the Department of Education Central Office trim down our learning competencies to come up with the most essential learning competencies. Then, we will have a walkthrough on the most essential learning competencies in science, and we will learn how to utilize them.
Processes and skills, and developing and demonstrating scientific attitudes and values. The acquisition of these domains is facilitated using the following approaches: multi-interdisciplinary approach, science technology society approach, contextual learning, problem issue-based learning, and inquiry-based approach. The approaches are based on sound educational pedagogy, namely constructivism, social cognition learning model, learning style theory, and brain-based learning. The original number of learning competencies in the science curriculum per grade level are as follows. Grade 7, 45 learning competencies. Grade 8, 48 learning competencies. Grade 9, 37 learning competencies. And grade 10, 29 learning competencies. A total of 159 learning competencies for junior high school level. The number of LCs varies per domain and per grade level. This is because of the intrinsic nature of the domain and the varying levels of the LCs crafted. The number of most essential learning competencies in science are as follows. Grade 7, 27 learning competencies. Grade 8, 30 learning competencies. Grade 9, 26 learning competencies. Grade 10, 24 learning competencies. A total of 107 most essential learning competencies for junior high school level. How did the Department of Education Central Office trim down the learning competencies to essential learning competencies? The department, through the Bureau of Curriculum Development, Curriculum Standards Development Division, in collaboration with the Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center, reviewed our curriculum, focused on the articulation within and across learning areas to identify gaps, issues, and concerns across learning areas and grade levels. Specifically, the review covers the following: mapping of the essential and desirable learning competencies within the curriculum, identification of prerequisite knowledge and skills needed to prepare students for essential learning competencies, and analysis of the interconnectedness of prerequisite knowledge and skills among the learning competencies for each subject area. In the example presented, most of the learning competencies are essential, which means these are what the students need, considered indispensable in the teaching learning process, to building skills, to equip learners for subsequent grade levels, and subsequently for lifelong learning. There are few learning competencies that are considered desirable. Desirable learning competencies may enhance education but may not be necessary in building foundational skills. The competency describe the internal structure of the earth is a desirable learning competency because the same contents were already introduced in grade 8. Another competency that is considered desirable is apply ray diagramming techniques in describing the characteristics and positions of images formed by lenses. The intent of the learning competency is the same as the competency preceding it. The learners can predict the qualitative characteristics of images formed by planed and curved mirrors and lenses through ray diagram. Hence, ray diagramming is already applied in preceding learning competency. From essential learning competencies to most essential learning competencies. These most essential learning competencies, or MELCs, were identified using the criterion endurance. Enduring competencies are those that remains with learners long after a test is completed. That is according to Reeves in 2002. Or is useful beyond a single test or unit of study, according to Maney and Horrell in 2014. They also refer to learning competencies which are essential in many professions and in everyday life. Here, you can observe that there is a missing code. This means that the MELCs is either merged or rephrased. Two or more learning competencies are merged or clustered into one comprehensive learning competency if they have the same objective or learning intention. Certain competencies were rephrased to be more concise. Since they are merged, there is no code assigned for this merged competency. Below, you can see that competency 2 for grade 3 quarter 2 week 3 to 4 is dropped. This means that the competency may be subsumed in another learning competency or deemed appropriate to be introduced in an earlier quarter or grade level or moved to a later quarter or grade level. We will now start the walkthrough of the most essential learning competencies for science. The presentation will be by domain. We will start with force and energy, earth and space, followed by living things and their environment, and then matter. Grade level standards for grade 7. Force and energy, earth and space. Learners can describe the motion of objects in terms of distance and speed and represent this in tables, graphs, charts, and equations. They can describe how various forms of energy travel through different media. Learners describe what makes up the Philippines as a whole and the resources found in the archipelago. They can explain the occurrence of breezes, monsoons, and ITCZ, and how these weather systems affect people. They can explain why seasons change and demonstrate how eclipses occur. Learning area, Science Grade 7. Here is an example of a learning competency that is rephrased. Relate characteristics of light, such as color and intensity, to frequency and wavelength. It is revised to explain color and intensity of light in terms of its wave characteristics. Why is it revised? Because the intention of the learning competency is for the students to discover the wave characteristics that define color and intensity or energy. Dropped competency. Describe the location of the Philippines with respect to the continents and oceans of the world. Why is it dropped? Because map reading and landforms or bodies of water are already discussed in Araling Panlipunan. With its competency, natutukoy ang relatibong lokasyon or relative location ng Pilipinas batay sa karatig bansa na nakapaligid dito gamit ang pangunahing at pangalawang direksyon. Drop competency. Differentiate quantities in terms of magnitude and direction. It is dropped because it is already subsumed in the discussion on the difference between speed and velocity and distance and displacement. Grade level standards for grade 8. Force and energy, earth and space. At the end of grade 8, learners can describe the factors that affect the motion of an object based on the laws of motion. They can differentiate the concept of work as used in science and in layman's language. They know the factors that affect the transfer of energy, such as temperature difference and the type of the medium. Could it be solid, liquid, or gas? Learner can also explain how active faults generate earthquakes and how tropical cyclones originate from warm ocean waters. They recognize other members of the solar system. Rephrase learning competency. Differentiate potential and kinetic energy. Revise to identify and explain the factors that affect potential and kinetic energy. It is revised because the learning competency was expounded, so the learners will have to identify the factors that affect potential and kinetic energy. Dropped competency. Differentiate electrical power and electrical energy. It is dropped because the same intention is expressed in grade 9. That is, explained how electrical energy is generated, transmitted, and distributed. Another rephrased learning competency is infer the relationship between current and charge. It is revised to infer the relationship between current and voltage. The reason for this revision is the content standards leads to Ohm's law, which is the relationship between current and voltage. Grade level standards for grade 9. Force and energy, earth and space. Learners can identify volcanoes and distinguish between active and inactive ones. They can explain how energy from volcanoes may be tapped for human use. They are familiar with climatic phenomena that occur in a global scale. They can explain why certain constellations can be seen only at certain times of the year. Learners can predict the outcomes of interactions among objects in real life, applying the laws of conservation of energy and momentum. Rephrased learning competency. Describe the different types of volcanoes. It is revised to describe the different types of volcanoes and volcanic eruption. Reason. The learning competency is expounded to include volcanic eruption, which is one way of classifying volcanoes. Dropped competencies. Infer that the arrangement of the stars in a group or constellation does not change, and observe that the position of the constellation changes in the course of a night. The reason for dropping these learning competencies is this topic is already subsumed in the discussion about observable constellations on a specific time of the year. Grade level standards for grade 10. Force and energy, earth and space. At the end of grade 10, learners realize that volcanoes and earthquakes occur in the same places in the world and that these are related to plate boundaries. They can demonstrate ways to ensure safety and reduce damage during earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. Learners can explain the factors affecting the balance and stability of an object to help them practice appropriate positions and movements to achieve efficiency and safety, such as in sports and dancing. They can analyze situations in which energy is harnessed for human use whereby heat is released. Dropped learning competency. Apply ray diagramming techniques in describing the characteristics and positions of images formed by lenses. The reason for dropping this competency is that this learning competency leads to the identification of qualitative characteristics of images formed by mirrors and lenses, which was already discussed by prior learning competency, that is, predict the qualitative characteristics, orientation, type, and magnification of images formed by plane and curved mirrors and lenses. Rephrased competency. Describe the distribution of active volcanoes, earthquake epicenters, and major mountain belts. It is revised to describe and relate the distribution of active volcanoes, earthquake epicenters, and major mountain belts to plate tectonic theory. The reason for revising this competency is that the students should also relate the location of active volcanoes, earthquake epicenters, and major mountain belts to the idea of plate tectonics. Another dropped competency. Describe the internal structure of the Earth. Why is it dropped? This topic had already been discussed in grade 8 with the competency explain how earthquake waves provide information about the interior of the Earth. Grade level standards, grade 7, living things and their environment. After studying how organ systems work together in plants and animals in the lower grade levels, learners can use a microscope when observing very small organisms and structures. Learners recognize that living things are organized into different levels: cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. These organisms comprise populations and communities, which interact with non-living things in ecosystems. Dropped competency. Identify beneficial and harmful microorganisms. The reason for dropping this competency is that it could be tackled in grade 8 with the competency classify microorganisms using the hierarchical taxonomic system. Another dropped competency is describe the process of fertilization. Now, this is dropped because it could be tackled in grade 5 with its learning competency describe the parts of the reproductive system and their functions. Grade level standards, grade 8, living things and their environment. Learners recognized reproduction as a process of cell division resulting in growth of organisms. Learners have delved deeper into the process of digestion as studied in the lower grades, giving emphasis on proper nutrition for overall wellness. Learners can participate in activities that protect and conserve economically important species used for food. Dropped learning competency. Explain how diseases of the digestive system are prevented, detected, and treated. Reason for dropping this competency. Covered in grade 6 third quarter and grade 7 health second quarter with the following competencies. Describe diseases and disorders caused by poor environmental sanitation. Explains how poor environmental sanitation can negatively impact the health of an individual. Identifies the nutritional problems of adolescents. Describes the characteristics, signs, and symptoms of malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. Discusses ways of preventing and controlling malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. Explain the characteristics, signs, and symptoms of eating disorders. Discusses ways of preventing and controlling eating disorders. And applies decision making and critical thinking skills to prevent nutritional problems of adolescents. Grade level standards, grade 9, living things and their environment. At the end of grade 9, learners have gained a deeper understanding of the digestive, respiratory, and circulatory systems to promote overall health. Learners have become familiar with some technologies that introduce desired traits in economically important plants and animals. Dropped competency. Describe the location of genes in chromosomes. The reason for dropping the competency. Covered in a grade 8 competency. Competency is compare mitosis and meiosis and their role in the cell division cycle. Grade level standards. Grade 10. Living things and their environment. Learner will have completed the study of the entire organism with their deeper study of the excretory and reproductive systems. Learner can explain in greater detail how genetic information is passed from parents to offspring and how diversity of species increases the probability of adaptation and survival in changing environments. Dropped competency. Suggest ways to minimize human impact on the environment. The reason for dropping the competency. It's covered in grade 8 with the competency suggest ways to minimize human impact on the environment. Grade level standards, grade 7, matter. At the end of grade 7, learners can distinguish mixtures from substances through semi-guided investigations. They realize the importance of fair testing when conducting investigations. Grade level standards, grade 8, matter. Learners can explain the behavior of matter in terms of the particles it is made of. They recognize that ingredients in food and medical products are made up of these particles and are absorbed by the body in the form of ions. Deleted competency. Trace the development of the periodic table from observations based on similarities in properties of elements. The reason for deletion. This learning competency can be merged with the succeeding learning competency as students are directed to make use of the periodic table to determine the properties of elements. We have retained competency, use the periodic table to predict the chemical behavior of an element. Grade level standards, grade 9, matter. Learners can explain how new materials are formed when atoms are rearranged. They recognize that a wide variety of useful compounds may arise from such rearrangements. Dropped competency. Describe how the Bohr model of the atom improved Rutherford's atomic model. The reason for dropping the competency. This learning competency may be subsumed in the discussion of the subatomic particles in grade 8. Merged competencies. Explain the formation of ionic and covalent bonds. Recognize different types of compounds, ionic or covalent, based on their properties such as melting point, hardness, polarity, and electrical and thermal conductivity. Now, from these two merged competencies, we have this most essential learning competency. Describe the different types of compounds based on the bonds they form and their properties such as melting point, hardness, polarity, and electrical and thermal conductivity. The reason for merging these two competencies. The discussion on how bonds are formed and how it affects the properties of a compound being formed leads to a more holistic understanding of the different types of compounds. Grade level standards, grade 10, matter. Learners can explain the importance of controlling the conditions under which a chemical reaction occurs. They recognize that cells and tissues of the human body are made up of water, a few kinds of ions, and biomolecules. These biomolecules may also be found in the food they eat. Rephrased learning competency. Recognize the major categories of biomolecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Revise to describe the major categories of biomolecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Reason. Revise to require the learner to describe the biomolecules, which is a higher level cognitive demand than just recognizing them. Let us all remember that releasing the most essential learning competencies is not a departure from the K 12 basic education science curriculum. The key stage and grade level standards are retained. It has the same vision of developing scientific, technological, and environmental literacy. The learning competencies were trimmed down to the most essential fundamental competencies our learners must acquire. How to use the most essential learning competencies or MELCs. Some MELCs are in broad statements, and we need to unpack them. There must be an alignment between the MELCs and the content standards and performance standards. In this time of pandemic, time allocation is flexible. Let us have an example. Grade 8 first quarter. Content standard. The learners demonstrate understanding of work using constant force, power, gravitational potential energy, kinetic energy, and elastic potential energy. Performance standard. The learners should be able to develop a written plan and implement a Newton's Olympics. Now, the milk for the following standards we have identify and explain the factors that affect the potential and kinetic energy. The milk mentioned can be unpacked to a more specific learning objectives. Again, the milk presented is identify and explain the factors that affect potential and kinetic energy. Here is an example of unpacked milk to learning objectives. Letter A. Defined and differentiate potential and kinetic energy. Letter B. Identify the factors that affect potential energy. C. Determine the mathematical variation between potential energy and mass and height from the ground. D. Compare the values of potential energy of varying masses at the same elevation from the ground. E. Identify the factors that affect kinetic energy. F. Determine the mathematical variation between kinetic energy and mass and velocity. G. Create and explain a concept map involving the terms kinetic energy, potential energy, mass, velocity, and elevation. And letter H. Demonstrate and explain the law of conservation of energy using a pendulum. The first 7 learning objectives respond to the content standard, demonstrate understanding of work using constant force, power, gravitational potential energy, kinetic energy, and elastic energy. The last learning objective helps the students prepare for the performance standard, that is to plan for Newton's Olympics. Now, by unpacking the milk, we were able to hit and accomplish the required standards. To have a copy of the latest milks, visit this link bit.do/MELC, all in capital letters, then S small letter 2020. Again, bit.do/MELCS 2020 for you to access the MELC's guidelines and learning area briefers. Let me end my presentation with this statement by Hans A. Beef. We need science education to produce scientists, but we need it equally to create literacy in the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Nance, for the notes presentation in mathematics and in science. So we have one, we have Mount from Santa Niña National High School. Also, we would like to thank our expert for presenting the notes science subject from South Comprehensive High School.
So at this point, we have on screen Ma'am Rowena Espere. Hello, ma'am.
Hi, hello, engineer and Ma'am Lucille.
By the way, for the information of everybody, Ma'am Rowena Espere or Ma'am Wang is renowned as one of the best speakers in our cluster and perhaps in our entire division. So she's accustomed speaking before a public. But this time, ma'am, I would just like to ask, how does it feel to speak in an online platform or to present in an online platform?
Okay, before I answer that question, Sir Kim, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our education program supervisor, Ma'am Genevieve Faye Pasamonte, for her guidance and assistance to make the presentation successful. Okay, going back, Sir Kim, of course, it is my privilege and I am so thankful for given the chance to present the most essential learning competencies in science. I hope that my colleagues in the department were able to understand how did the Department of Education Central Office trim down our learning competencies to the most essential learning competencies and how to utilize them.
All right, thank you for that answer, Ma'am Wang.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, Ma'am Weng. So another question
Okay.
that I will give to you is that for these school years, a new normal, 2020 to 2021. So how are you feeling, or are you feeling challenged for this year's new normal?
Okay, so yes, the new normal setup is very challenging, right, Ma'am Lucille? But of course, our department, the Department of Education, are doing their very best to prepare the teachers for this school year. In fact, no, yesterday, the regional monitoring team visited the Mintal Comprehensive High School, checking the learning continuity plan of the school. And congratulations to Mintal Comprehensive High School. No, the regional monitoring team rated 4.5, a scale of 5 to Mintal Comprehensive High School. Congratulations to MCHS team. No, so ready, and I know that all the schools in the cluster 6 are so ready for this school year.
So true enough, Mom, we would like to congratulate the Mintal Comprehensive High School for a job well done. So
Yes.
especially to our principal and school cluster 6 supervisor, Sir Janito Augalan. Congratulations once again.
So once again, that has been Ma'am Rowena Espere, the Cluster 6 Science Coordinator.
Thank
Right.
you.
So I suppose at this point, we should move forward to our open forum. Right, so do we have some questions from our training participants? All right, so it seems
Okay.
that the presentation has been clear enough. So I suppose we should be proceeding to reading some of our shout outs from our participants.
So at this juncture, let me read and hear some shout outs from our teachers in Cluster 6. So you may
Okay.
You may please write your shout outs or greetings in the comment section.
All right, so we have here from Mintal Comprehensive High Schools from Sir Ariel Nino Aton. Pa-shout out po. So shout out to Sir Ariel.
Shout out po. Okay, also we have Sir Janito Ugdang. So he is from Tugbuk National High School. So he said, more power to you, Ma'am Weng from Tugbuk National High School.
Hello,
Yay!
Sir
Yay.
Jobit.
Sir you.
Sir you. Okay, so we would like to thank all our presenters for sharing your time and sharing your talents as you present the most essential learning competencies for this school year. So maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, presenters. So that concludes our morning session, and it has been a productive morning and has indeed provided us further knowledge about the most essential learning competencies for the school year 2020 to 2021.
Okay, so to all our participants, please be right back at exactly 1 p.m. for our afternoon plenary session right on the Cluster 6 Facebook page.
And watch out for the junior high school breakout link, for we still have 4 remaining presentations to look forward. So
Well,
I think
that
that
ends
ends
our
our
session
session
for
for
this
this morning.
morning.